In 1907, in a small mining town called Monongah in north-central West Virginia, the ground itself seemed to exhale. Two connected coal mines exploded within seconds of each other, and the blast was so powerful that it lifted railroad cars off their tracks and shattered windows nearly a mile away. 361 men and boys died underground that day, though some historians believe the true number, once uncounted contract workers are included, was closer to 500. It remains the deadliest mining disaster in United States history. Of the men confirmed dead, 171 were Italian immigrants, many of them fresh off the boat, sent underground within weeks of arriving in America because that was the only work anyone would give them. They had crossed an ocean for this, and when their widows needed something to feed their surviving sons before sending them down into the same mines the next morning, many of them reached for the same two things: a hunk of bread and a stick of spicy cured sausage that did not exist anywhere in Italy. Pepperoni. Not gold, not silver, not some secret recipe smuggled out of the old country, a meat that Italy never made, invented by Italians who could not go home. It is worth about $3 a pound today, thrown carelessly onto a 30-minute pizza delivery, eaten cold out of the refrigerator by teenagers who have never thought about it for more than 4 seconds. So how did a sausage invented by desperate, grieving, unwelcome immigrants become the single most popular pizza topping on the planet, so thoroughly Italian in the American imagination that most people would bet their life savings it came from Naples or Calabria? That was 1907. But the story of pepperoni does not start in a coal town, and it does not even start in Italy. It starts in Rome, more than 2,000 years earlier, with a much simpler problem. Meat rots, and nobody had invented the refrigerator yet. Ancient Rome did not have electricity, obviously, and it did not have tin cans, and it certainly did not have plastic wrap. What it had was salt, and salt turned out to be one of the most powerful pieces of food technology human beings had ever discovered. Somewhere around the 3rd century before the Common Era, Roman butchers and home cooks began packing ground pork and beef with salt, herbs, and spices, then stuffing the mixture into cleaned animal intestines to dry and cure. The Romans called this general category of preserved, ground, and stuffed meat insisia, and later writers used the word botulus for the sausage itself, a word that would eventually, and rather unfortunately, give us the modern term botulism. They did not know the word bacteria. They had no concept of a microbe. What they understood, through generations of trial, error, and the occasional funeral, was that salt pulled moisture out of meat, and moisture was what bacteria needed to survive and multiply. Take away the moisture, and you take away the rot. They were doing sophisticated food chemistry with absolutely none of the underlying science, purely through inherited, repeated, hard-won observation. Think about that for a second. Every time a Roman butcher packed a sausage with salt, instead of just letting the meat sit, he was making a bet, with his own family's health, that this batch would not kill anyone. Over centuries, those bets accumulated into a body of practical knowledge that modern food science would not formally explain until the 19th century. Picture the actual process, because it matters. A Roman household or small commercial butcher would slaughter a pig, and rather than let anything go to waste, they would take the trimmings, the fattier cuts, and the less desirable pieces that would not sell well fresh, and grind them down. Salt was worked through the mixture by hand, along with whatever herbs and spices were locally available, and the resulting paste was packed tightly into a cleaned length of intestine, tied off, and hung in a cool, dry space to cure. No refrigeration, no chemical preservatives, no vacuum sealing. Just salt, airflow, and time. Depending on the size and fat content of the sausage, curing could take anywhere from a few weeks to several months. And during that time, a slow, controlled fermentation process was quietly taking place, one that Roman butchers could not have explained scientifically but clearly understood empirically. Beneficial bacteria converted sugars in the meat into lactic acid, which lowered the pH of the sausage and made it inhospitable to the harmful bacteria that cause spoilage and illness. This is precisely the same biochemical principle that underlies the production of yogurt, sauerkraut, and modern dry-cured salami today. The Romans, without laboratories, without microscopes, without any concept of what a bacterium even was, had stumbled into a functional understanding of food fermentation that would not be formally described by science for roughly 2,000 years. That gap alone should tell you something about how much trial, error, and quiet accumulated genius went into a food most people today do not think about for more than the time it takes to order a pizza. This was not a luxury food. In a world without refrigeration, cured and salted meat was often the difference between having protein through a long winter and having nothing at all. Preserved sausage let ordinary Roman households use every part of a slaughtered animal, including the scraps, the trimmings, and the organ meat that would otherwise spoil within a day or two of butchering. It let armies march. Roman legions carried cured meats on campaign because fresh meat simply could not survive weeks on the road, and a soldier who could not eat was a soldier who could not fight. Salt itself, incidentally, was such a critical commodity to the Roman state that soldiers were sometimes partially paid in it, and the word salary literally comes from the Latin salarium, tied directly to the word for salt. This was not about seasoning food. Preserved meat was military infrastructure. It fed armies, it fed cities, and it turned a fragile, fast-spoiling resource into something that could be stockpiled, taxed, traded, and controlled. Rome fell, but the technique did not. It scattered across the Italian peninsula, and over the following 15 centuries, nearly every region of what would eventually become Italy developed its own local variation. Tuscany had its own style. Calabria had its own style. Basilicata, Apulia, Liguria, all of them developed distinct salami traditions, shaped by local climate, local pigs, and local taste. By some counts, Italy today recognizes more than 150 distinct named varieties of salami: soppressata, salsiccia, salame piccante. Each one tied to a specific town, a specific family, sometimes a specific hillside. This regional stubbornness, this refusal to standardize, is going to matter enormously later in this story, because it explains why no single correct version of a spicy Italian sausage ever crossed the Atlantic intact. There was no single recipe to copy. There were 150 of them, and immigrants would eventually have to improvise 150 first. But here is the detail that makes this whole story strange. None of those 150 Italian salami traditions used chili peppers. They could not have. Chili peppers, along with tomatoes, did not exist anywhere in Europe, Asia, or Africa until the very end of the 15th century. Before Christopher Columbus, an Italian butcher curing meat in Calabria had never seen a chili pepper in his life, because the plant simply was not there to see. That is going to matter in a moment. This story starts almost 2,000 years before any Italian ever tasted the ingredient that would eventually define pepperoni, and for most of that time, the recipe for what would become pepperoni was, quite literally, chemically impossible to make. Rome eventually fell, cracking apart under the weight of invasion, civil war, and economic collapse, but the technique of salt-curing ground meat did not fall with it. It simply scattered, carried outward by the same trade routes, monasteries, and rural households that preserved so much of the ancient world's practical knowledge through the chaos of the following centuries. Across the fractured Italian peninsula, cut off from any centralized government for well over 1,000 years, curing traditions did not standardize. They diverged, sharpened by geography, climate, and stubborn local pride. A butcher in the cool, damp mountains of Basilicata cured meat differently than a butcher on the warm Ligurian coast, because the climate itself demanded different techniques, different fat ratios, different drying times. Families guarded their specific spice combinations as closely as anything else they owned, passing recipes down through generations by memory and demonstration rather than written record. This regional stubbornness would eventually become one of the defining features of Italian food culture as a whole, the fierce, sometimes comical insistence that the version made 2 towns over is simply wrong. It is the same instinct that today still fuels arguments over whether pineapple belongs anywhere near a pizza. But it also meant that by the time Italy finally unified into a single nation in the middle of the 19th century, there was no such thing as one authoritative Italian salami. There were, by some counts, more than 150 distinct regional varieties, each one a small, stubborn monument to a specific hillside, a specific family, a specific way of doing things. Halfway around the world, in the highlands of what is now Mexico, Bolivia, and Peru, indigenous peoples have been cultivating and using capsicum peppers for thousands of years, with archaeological evidence of their use in cooking stretching back roughly 7,500 years. When Christopher Columbus landed in the Caribbean in 1492, he was famously looking for a sea route to the spice markets of Asia, and specifically for black pepper, which at the time was so valuable in Europe that it was sometimes called black gold. When he encountered the local capsicum plants, with their sharp, biting heat, he assumed he had found some relative of the pepper he already knew. He was wrong. Chili peppers are not related to black pepper at all. They belong to an entirely different plant family that evolved on the opposite side of the planet. But the mistake stuck. He called them peppers, recorded them in Spanish as pimienta, and that single error rippled outward into dozens of languages. The English word pepper, the Portuguese pimenta, the German Pfeffer, all of them trace back to one Genoese sailor's honest confusion about two completely unrelated plants 530 years ago. And here is the twist that becomes important very soon. Even though these chili peppers were not remotely related to black pepper, Europeans kept calling them peppers anyway, and Italians eventually started calling their bell pepper varieties pepperoni, the plural of pepperoni. Remember that word. It is going to explain, several centuries later, why one of America's favorite meats has a completely misleading name. Within about 100 years of Columbus's voyage, chili peppers had spread with startling speed across Africa, Asia, and Europe, carried by Portuguese and Spanish trade networks, and, grimly, along the same routes used by the transatlantic slave trade. They reached West Africa by the mid-1500s. They reached India and China not long after, transforming cuisines that had previously relied almost entirely on black pepper and ginger for their heat. And they reached the Balkans and Hungary by way of Ottoman trade routes, where Hungarian farmers eventually bred a milder, fleshier variety and dried it into the ground red spice known today as paprika. Southern Italy, and Calabria in particular, was one of the earliest and most enthusiastic European adopters of the new chili peppers, likely because the region already had extensive trading contact across the Mediterranean. For the first time in the history of Italian cured meat, going back 2,000 years to those original Roman Botulism sausages, it was suddenly possible to make a salami that was not just salty and savory, but genuinely, aggressively spicy. This is where the story takes a turn nobody in ancient Rome could have predicted. A South American berry, misidentified by a lost Italian sailor working for the Spanish crown, traveled halfway around the world and landed in the one country whose meat-curing tradition was old enough, established enough, and regionally fragmented enough to absorb it into 150 different local variations. Calabrian spicy salami, the closest thing Italy has ever produced to pepperoni, was born from that collision. And yet, and this is the detail worth sitting with, it was still not pepperoni. Not quite. It was hotter, denser, more slowly cured, and made almost exclusively from pork. The final ingredient, the one that would turn an Italian regional specialty into a completely new American food, was not a spice at all. It was desperation, an ocean, and a very particular kind of poverty. Italy, as a unified political entity, is astonishingly young. For most of its history, the peninsula was a patchwork of independent kingdoms, city-states, and foreign-controlled territories, and it was not stitched together into a single nation until 1861. Unification did not deliver the prosperity many southern Italians had hoped for. If anything, it made things worse. The new national government in the north imposed heavy taxes on staples like wheat and salt, taxes that fell hardest on the rural farmers and fishermen of the south, a region known as the Mezzogiorno. Through the 1880s, malaria and agricultural disease ravaged the countryside. Land was scarce, inherited in shrinking fragments across generations of large families, and industrial development, which was transforming the North, largely bypassed the South entirely. For millions of Italians in Calabria, Sicily, Basilicata, and the surrounding regions, the choice was stark. Stay and watch your children go hungry on land that could no longer support them, or leave and hope that a country on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean would give you a chance that your own country would not. Imagine the actual decision involved. Leaving Italy in this period did not mean a short flight and a return ticket. It meant weeks crammed into the crowded steerage compartments of a transatlantic steamship, often with limited food, poor sanitation, and a very real risk of disease spreading through the packed lower decks. It meant arriving at a processing center like Ellis Island, standing in long lines, undergoing medical inspections that could, in theory, send you straight back across the ocean if an inspector decided you looked unwell. And it meant doing all of that with the understanding that you might never see your parents, your siblings, or your home village again. In the 1880s alone, roughly 300,000 Italians made this journey. In the 1890s, that number roughly doubled to 600,000. In the first decade of the 20th century, it exploded past 2 million. This was not a slow trickle of curious travelers. It was a mass exodus, driven by hunger, and it kept accelerating for nearly 4 decades before American immigration law finally shut the door. They left in numbers that are difficult to fully comprehend even today. Between 1880 and 1920, more than 4 million Italians immigrated to the United States. Some estimates place the true figure closer to 4.2 million. No other ethnic group in American history had sent so many people in such a concentrated burst of time. About 80% of them came from that same impoverished southern region, the Mezzogiorno, and roughly a third of all Italian immigrants who arrived during this period ended up settling in New York City alone, packing into dense, overcrowded neighborhoods that quickly became known as Little Italy. This was not a gentle, welcomed migration. It was mass displacement driven by hunger, and it arrived at a moment when American nativism was already primed to see it as a threat. Here is the part of this story that most people never learn, and it is not a small footnote. It is central to understanding why pepperoni exists at all. Italian immigrants, and especially Southern Italians and Sicilians, were met with ferocious, often violent prejudice in the United States. They were stereotyped as criminals, as anarchists, as racially inferior, as a threat to the American social order. In 1891, in New Orleans, after a jury acquitted several Sicilian immigrants accused of murdering the city's police chief, a mob stormed the parish jail and lynched 11 Sicilian men. It remains one of the largest single mass lynchings in American history, and at the time, several major American newspapers openly praised it. This did not happen once, in one city, and then stop. Anti-Italian violence, exclusion, and discrimination continued for decades, and it fed directly into the immigration restrictions that would eventually choke off the wave entirely, culminating in the Immigration Act of 1924, which imposed strict quotas specifically designed to reduce the number of Southern and Eastern Europeans allowed into the country. This decision seemed, to the politicians who wrote it, like simple bureaucratic housekeeping. It was not. It was a direct, documented statement that Italian immigrants were considered less desirable than immigrants from Northern Europe, and Italian-American communities felt the weight of that judgment every single day, in housing, in hiring, and in the kind of casual public contempt that does not always show up in the history books. If you are finding this interesting so far, go ahead and hit subscribe. This channel covers the hidden history behind the food on your table every single week, and the second half of Pepperoni's story, the part where a sausage nobody in Italy has ever heard of becomes one of the most eaten meats in the world, is even stranger than the first. Let us keep going. So picture the situation these immigrants actually landed in. They arrived in cities like New York with generations of inherited knowledge about how to cure meat, about which spices worked, about how long a sausage needed to hang before it was safe and flavorful. And then they discovered that almost none of the specific ingredients they had grown up with were readily or affordably available in the United States. The exact breeds of pig raised in southern Italy did not exist here. The precise regional spice blends were not being imported in bulk. Even the climate conditions that Italian curing houses had relied on for centuries, cool, humid, specifically ventilated cellars, were not something a butcher shop in Lower Manhattan could easily replicate. So Italian butchers did what immigrant communities have always done when faced with this exact problem. They improvised. They took the deep structural knowledge of Roman-derived salami making, thousands of years of accumulated technique, and applied it to whatever American ingredients were actually sitting on the shelf. That meant American paprika. It meant American chili spice blends, easy to source, cheap, and shelf-stable. It meant, crucially, a meat blend of beef and pork, rather than the pork-dominant recipes common across most of Italy, partly because American meatpacking and inspection standards of the era made a beef and pork combination easier to produce, transport, and legally certify as safe for the mass market. Here is the uncomfortable irony that sits at the center of this entire video. The immigrants were not trying to invent something new. They were trying, as best they could, to recreate something old, something from home, something that reminded them of a country that had just spent 40 years starving them out and then treating them like criminals on arrival. And in that act of imperfect, resourceful imitation, missing the exact ingredients, missing the exact climate, working with American paprika instead of Calabrian chili, they accidentally created something that had never existed anywhere on Earth before. There is a specific regulatory detail here that rarely makes it into the popular version of this story, and it explains one of the most distinctive features of American pepperoni. Traditional Italian salami recipes leaned heavily, and in many regions almost exclusively, on pork. American meat inspection standards of the early 20th century, however, created practical and economic incentives for producers to blend pork with beef, since beef was more readily available through the American cattle industry, and helped stabilize the texture and fat content of a sausage being produced at increasingly industrial volumes. So Italian-American butchers adapted again, folding beef into recipes that, back in Calabria or Basilicata, would have used pork alone. This was not a betrayal of tradition so much as one more layer of improvisation stacked on top of all the others, another small compromise made necessary by a new country with new rules and new supply chains. Here is the pattern worth noticing. At every single stage of this story, from the missing Calabrian pig breeds to the unavailable regional spices to the American meat inspection rules, the people making pepperoni were not trying to invent something original. They were trying to get as close as possible to something they had lost. And the gap between the memory and the result is precisely what pepperoni is. The first documented use of the word pepperoni for the specific sausage appears in 1919 in New York City. By that point, Italian butcher shops had become a fixture of the city's immigrant neighborhoods, and pepperoni sausage was showing up on delicatessen counters and in Italian sandwich shops across Lower Manhattan. It is worth pausing on the name itself, because it is a small linguistic accident that tells you everything about how confused this whole process was. In Italian, pepperone simply means bell pepper. It does not mean sausage, spicy or otherwise. So when Italian-American butchers needed a name for this new chili-spiced paprika-red salami, they reached for a word that back in the old country referred to a completely different vegetable. This was not, it turns out, some careful marketing decision. It was an improvised label for an improvised food, and it stuck so thoroughly that a century later, if you order a pepperoni pizza in most of Italy today, you are likely to get a pizza covered in roasted bell peppers, because that is what the word pepperoni has always meant there. The meat, the actual American pepperoni sausage, is functionally absent from Italian cuisine. You cannot walk into most butcher shops in Rome or Naples and buy it because it was never Italian to begin with. It was invented in a Manhattan tenement kitchen by people trying and failing to recreate a homeland that had already stopped wanting them. At first, pepperoni was not a pizza topping at all. In its earliest years, through the 1920s and into the 1930s, it primarily showed up in Italian delicatessen sandwiches, sliced onto Italian-style bread and sold to working-class customers in Italian-American neighborhoods, largely unknown outside of them. Pizza itself was still a niche regional food in America at this point, associated almost entirely with Italian immigrant enclaves in cities like New York, where Lombardi's, widely credited as the first licensed pizzeria in the United States, had opened its doors in 1905. Pepperoni and pizza existed at this stage in parallel, both Italian-American inventions. Both still confined largely to Little Italy neighborhoods, waiting for the specific set of post-war circumstances that would eventually push them together and into the American mainstream. But before pepperoni ever made it onto a pizza, it was already saving lives underground. And this is where we come back to Monongah and to the coal fields of West Virginia. Beginning in the early 1900s, waves of Italian immigrants, many of them from Calabria, found work in the coal mining industry of north-central West Virginia. Work that was brutal, dangerous, and frequently fatal, as the Monongah disaster of 1907 had already shown in the most horrifying way possible. Italian mining families brought their food traditions with them, and it became common for miners to carry a simple lunch underground: a piece of Italian bread in one hand, a stick of cured pepperoni in the other. Sometime between 1927 and 1938, a former coal miner named Giuseppe Argiro, who had emigrated from Calabria in 1920 to work the mines around Clarksburg, left the pits and opened an Italian bakery in Fairmont, West Virginia, called the People's Bakery. Argiro remembered watching his fellow miners struggle to eat a two-handed lunch, 100 feet underground, in cramped, dark, physically demanding conditions where a free hand mattered. So he combined the two halves of that lunch into one object. He baked sticks of pepperoni directly into rolled bread dough, creating a portable, shelf-stable, one-handed meal that a miner could eat with one grip while working with the other. He sold the earliest versions for about 45 cents a dozen. It became the pepperoni roll, and it remains, to this day, a beloved regional food across West Virginia, so deeply embedded in the state's identity that Fairmont has officially declared itself the pepperoni roll capital of the world. Whether Argiro personally invented the very first pepperoni roll, or simply commercialized and perfected a version that miners' wives had already been quietly baking at home, remains genuinely debated among local historians. But the result of his bakery is beyond dispute. It turned a wartime survival food, born out of poverty, discrimination, and underground danger, into a piece of permanent American regional cuisine. Now, that origin story is warm, resourceful, even a little charming in its way. And it is worth taking a moment here to be honest about the darker context surrounding it, because the channel does not sanitize the hard parts. The same coal industry that employed thousands of Italian immigrants like Argiro was also responsible for staggering loss of life. The Monongah explosion of 1907 killed at least 361 men, 171 of them Italian, and it was only one of dozens of mining disasters across Appalachia during this era. Italian immigrant miners were frequently assigned the most dangerous underground positions, paid less than native-born workers for the same labor, and denied basic safety protections that mine owners considered too expensive to implement. Pepperoni, in its earliest American form, is inseparable from this history. It was not born in a test kitchen or a corporate lab. It was born in the lunch pails of men who were sent into some of the most dangerous workplaces in industrial America by a country that had welcomed their labor far more readily than it had welcomed them. Here is where this story turns towards something lighter, because pepperoni's real explosion into the American mainstream did not come from the mines. It came from a war. When American soldiers were stationed in Italy during the Second World War, many of them encountered pizza for the first time, and they came home in the mid-1940s with a genuine appetite for it. This created sudden, widespread demand for a food that up to that point had still been largely confined to Italian-American immigrant neighborhoods in a handful of major cities. Pizza needed to scale fast to meet a national audience that had just discovered it, and pizzerias needed toppings that were cheap to produce, easy to store without refrigeration failures, and durable enough to ship across a rapidly expanding country. Pepperoni fit every single one of those requirements almost perfectly. It was already cured and shelf-stable by design, a direct inheritance from those 2,000-year-old Roman preservation techniques. It was inexpensive to manufacture at scale using standard American beef and pork, and it rendered beautifully under heat, curling at the edges, releasing its paprika-red fat into the cheese in a way that frankly looked spectacular on a plate. By around 1950, pizzerias in Connecticut and across the Northeast were selling pepperoni pizza as a standard menu item, and the combination that most of the world now considers definitively, quintessentially Italian was actually less than a generation old. There is another piece of this puzzle that is easy to overlook, and it has nothing to do with meat at all. It has to do with ovens. Neapolitan pizza, in its original form, was baked in wood-fired brick ovens that could reach blistering temperatures well above 800 degrees Fahrenheit, cooking a thin crust pizza in a matter of minutes. That kind of oven was expensive to build, slow to heat, and completely impractical for a rapidly expanding American pizzeria chain trying to open dozens of new locations a year. The post-war boom in American pizza depended just as much on a mundane piece of engineering as it did on returning soldiers craving a taste of Italy. Commercial gas-fired pizza ovens, refined and mass-produced in the years following the Second World War, allowed pizzerias to reach high, consistent baking temperatures without the cost, the fuel logistics, or the skilled labor required to run a wood-fired oven. A pizzeria could now be opened in a strip mall in Ohio with the same basic equipment as one in Brooklyn. This is the unglamorous, unromantic engineering detail that most pizza histories skip entirely, and it deserves credit because pepperoni could not have conquered American pizza without a piece of equipment that made pizza itself cheap and repeatable enough to scale nationally in the first place. The infrastructure of American convenience did the rest. In the post-war decades, chain restaurants transformed pizza from a neighborhood specialty into a national industry. Pizza Hut and other early chains began opening locations across the country through the 1950s and 60s, and Domino's followed shortly after, eventually building an empire specifically around fast, standardized delivery. Improvements in commercial gas ovens, refrigerated trucking, and industrial meat processing meant that pepperoni could be manufactured in bulk, shipped nationwide, and sliced with mechanical consistency, transforming a once artisanal immigrant food into a mass-produced commodity almost indistinguishable from region to region. Frozen pizza brought pepperoni into American home freezers, and by the second half of the 20th century, the sausage that had been improvised out of desperation and mismatched ingredients in a Manhattan tenement had become the default, expected topping on the most popular fast food in the country. Meanwhile, in Italy itself, the actual homeland, pepperoni as Americans understand it barely exists. This is not an accident. It never left New York because it never came from anywhere else. If you walk into a pizzeria in Rome today and order a pizza pepperoni, expecting the spicy red sausage you know from home, you will almost certainly be served a pizza topped with roasted or sautéed bell peppers, because that is what the word has always meant on that side of the Atlantic. A small number of tourist-oriented restaurants in major Italian cities have started stocking something closer to the American product, specifically to accommodate confused visitors. But outside of those specific pockets, the sausage genuinely, meaningfully, does not exist in its country of supposed origin. Food historian John F. Mariani, who has written extensively on the global spread of Italian cuisine, has called pepperoni purely an Italian-American creation, and that description holds up under scrutiny in a way that very few food origin claims actually do. This is one of the rare cases where the popular myth and the historical record point in exactly the same direction. Pepperoni is not Italian food that got adapted for America. It is American food, made by Italians, for other Italians, that eventually got mistaken by the entire world for something it never was. Today, the numbers are almost absurd relative to where this story started. The global pizza market was worth somewhere in the neighborhood of $200 billion in 2025. with Americans alone consuming an estimated 3 billion pizzas every single year. Pepperoni sits at the very center of that industry. It is used on roughly 36% of all pizzas ordered in the United States, making it, by a wide margin, the single most popular topping in the country, ahead of mushrooms, sausage, and every vegetable combined. The average American now spends somewhere around $150 a year on pizza alone. The global pepperoni market itself, just the sausage, separate from the pizzas it sits on, was valued at roughly $2.5 billion in the early 2020s and continues to grow. Major American meat producers now manufacture pepperoni on an industrial scale for chains that operate thousands of locations apiece. Companies like Hormel and Tyson supply pepperoni to a pizza economy where a single national chain can operate more than 6,000 restaurants in the United States alone, each one moving through a volume of sliced, cured sausage that would have been unimaginable to a Manhattan deli butcher in 1919. The United States Department of Agriculture now maintains strict federal safety and inspection standards specifically governing processed pork and beef products like pepperoni. Standards that, in a strange full-circle way, exist to formally guarantee the exact same outcome that Roman salt curing was blindly chasing more than 2,000 years earlier: meat that will not make you sick. It is the same basic problem, solved twice, once through inherited folk practice and once through federal regulation, separated by roughly 20 centuries and an entire ocean. And the demand shows no sign of slowing. Analysts project the global pepperoni market will continue growing steadily through the rest of this decade, driven largely by the continued global expansion of American-style pizza chains into markets across Asia and Latin America, carrying a sausage born out of immigrant poverty in Lower Manhattan into cities that, a century ago, had never heard of it at all. But pepperoni is more than just a pizza topping at this point, and this next part tends to catch people off guard. Its chemistry has become something of a minor internet phenomenon in its own right. Because pepperoni is high in fat and cured with specific spice blends, it curls and cups dramatically when baked at high heat, forming little bowls that pool hot, paprika-tinted grease, a texture so visually distinctive that it has become a defining feature of a certain style of artisanal, high-heat pizza in the last decade, chased specifically by pizzerias trying to recreate that crispy, curled, blistered edge. Food scientists have even studied the specific ratio of fat content and casing tension that produces the most dramatic curl. Think about that. An immigrant sausage born out of poverty and improvisation is now the subject of genuine culinary engineering, chased deliberately by chefs trying to reverse engineer a texture that originally happened by accident. So think back to where this story actually began. It was there, in an unrecognizable form, in the salted, stuffed sausages of ancient Rome, feeding legions who could not carry fresh meat into battle. It was there when a lost Italian sailor working for Spain misidentified a South American berry as a relative of a completely different plant, and in doing so, accidentally gave southern Italy the one ingredient its 2,000-year-old curing tradition had been missing the entire time. It was there when 4 million Italians, fleeing hunger and a country that had just finished unifying without them in mind, crossed an ocean into a nation that met them with lynch mobs, quotas, and casual contempt. It was there in the lunch pails of coal miners working under West Virginia mountains that had already swallowed hundreds of their countrymen in a single afternoon in 1907. And it was there, finally, when American soldiers came home from a war in Italy, craving a food they had only just discovered, and turned an obscure immigrant sausage into the most popular pizza topping on the entire planet. Pepperoni was never actually Italian. It was never really trying to be. It was an act of memory, performed with the wrong ingredients, in the wrong country, by people the wrong country did not particularly want, and somehow, out of all of that displacement and improvisation and grief, it became one of the most beloved foods in the world. Not bad for a sausage named after a vegetable it does not even contain. If any part of this surprised you, let me know in the comments which detail got you, whether it was the mining disaster, the mislabeled chili peppers, or the fact that pepperoni pizza in Rome will get you a plate of roasted bell peppers instead. And if you liked digging into the hidden history behind something this ordinary, do me a favor and hit subscribe, because there are a lot more stories like this one coming, and I will see you in the next one.